I'm Doug Randall. I'm founder and CEO of Protagonist.
Doug, what is Protagonist?
So, Protagonist is a company that helps organizations identify, measure, and then shape narratives. And by narratives, we mean the stories that are having an impact on an organization in some way. Now, sometimes those stories are well understood and clear, and sometimes they're not. But always they're moving consumers, customers, and the broader population to take some sort of action. And so understanding them is very important.
How do we measure?
So we measure the narrative in a few ways. The first trick is just to figure out kind of what are they? And then we measure them by looking at how often they're published, how often they're shared, how often they're engaged with in social media or rebroadcasted in traditional media. So we have all kinds of ways of getting what we call narrative impact, which effectively is a measurement of the resonance. Let's just look at the narratives surrounding Uber, right? So Uber had some pretty significant issues going on inside its company, and let's move the facts aside for a second. The facts, as many people would understand them, are that the company is very aggressive with regulators. The company has some policies that are fairly aggressive as well with its drivers. And then working at Uber is not exactly the easiest place to work. It works its employees pretty hard. Well, those may be facts, and there's all kinds of things that we can do to understand whether or not those are true or not. But the narrative on Uber is very much that the company is heartless. And that narrative, whether supported by facts or not, has wound up causing many people, certainly many consumers, to stop using the service, and they've moved over to Lyft. The power of that narrative is extremely has extremely large impact on Uber's success. That's just one example, but there are narratives about sugar that affect chocolate companies, and there are narratives about millennials that impact marketers, and on and on. And these narratives, I think what's so interesting about them is very often they're hard to back up by fact, but people move so quickly to understand, is it factually correct? When we think that studying the narrative itself is really of value as well.
Back up a little bit and tell me more about narrative science. What is it grounded in?
So great question, because narratives have been around forever, and academics and many others have thought about different aspects of narrative. I mean, God, even defining what a narrative is can be the cause of a dissertation, right? When we talk about narratives, we're a little bit loose about our definition. We just mean a story or belief that's driving behavior that matters. We could get far more precise. We could look at story structure and all kinds of issues, but we're basically looking for a logic. Okay, a logic. I believe this, and therefore I do this. I believe that sugar is bad, and therefore I don't eat chocolate. Or I believe that the candy companies are hiding something, and therefore I want regulation on them. That kind of a thing. And so those narratives wind up actually having an enormous impact on what people actually choose to do, whether they buy a product, whether they support a brand, whether they boycott a situation.
I mean, as a graduate student, I studied propaganda, persuasion, and communication. These were essentially about narratives, whether true or false.
There are ways of communicating narratives that are more likely to persuade others. And so understanding those structures is valuable. The other point you're making is that narratives may or may not be grounded in fact, and that might be a different discipline. And I think that's true too. One thing that's at the heart of what we're really doing is all we're trying to do is hold up a mirror. We're really just trying to say, this is what people are saying and believing. using data, using the current forms of technology, and the fact that people are expressing themselves everywhere now, we're simply trying to show what people are actually saying and believing. Because if you want to influence them, or if you want to develop an effective strategy, it's best to know everything that's out there. And as we've seen in this country and really around the world, sometimes we get consumed only by the media that we're looking at. And so we assume a belief system is resonant when it may or may not actually be, or we assume more resonance or less resonance than actually may be out there. So what narrative analytics, what Protagonist is really doing is it's saying, let's look at all of the narratives. Let's identify that full range of beliefs. Let's measure that full range of beliefs, and let's show how it's changed over time and what seems to be driving it, so that you can then use that either to change your strategy or perhaps to try to influence the narrative yourself.
And as I understand it, then you're looking at big data across all channels that are accessible?
That's right. So anything that's digitized, we look at, which means social media, traditional media, websites, blogs. We've worked with some companies on looking at employee reviews. We look at comment sections. Basically, if it's digital, our engine can just suck it in and look at what is the underlying meaning there, and then categorize it and categorize the narratives.
Is there any relationship then between what you do and what I've read about with Cambridge Analytica and the election last year, where they seem to be trying to identify what was resonating with certain groups?
Yeah, so the I don't know Cambridge Analytica too well, but I too have read the articles on them. One major difference is that my understanding is that they tend to operate at the individual level or very small group level, right? So typical campaign work is looking at people on a block or even individual households and what their beliefs are, and we're working at the aggregate level. For privacy reasons and a whole lot of other reasons. We're looking at the essence of a discourse, not at individuals. But in that, what they were trying to do is understand deeper beliefs and what's driving and motivating people. That is the core of what we do. Well, so we got our start actually working for the government. Our very first work in this space was for the National Security Council, and working at times with intelligence organizations. And all of that work has been about understanding at the population level, what is it that people believe? The way it all started for us was actually around designing the methodology. And the question was, if we want to understand what a population, let's say Afghanistan, or even, or Iran, or even countries that we're completely, that are completely friendly. What is it that population believes about America? Rather than in addition to, you can augment polling and some of the more traditional ways of gathering that information with something different, which is, what are the filters? What are the beliefs that those people in those countries actually hold? And when we developed the methodology, we call these master narratives, borrowing from the anthropological concept. And we were looking at what are the underlying belief systems. We then saw that was working quite well, not necessarily to understand directly what are people saying specifically about America, but what do they believe about politics, about economics, about social and environmental issues. And when we understood that full range of narratives, we could then imagine the filters that populations would use to understand messaging or negotiations concepts or anything like that. And so in that sense, we have supported strategic information operations, not done on the tactical stuff, but very strategic operations in which we're just trying to understand what people actually think. And just to give an example, I mean, a very small example, but if you're an American, the typical American would look at something like oil and gas as a commodity, right? It's just a good that's traded back and forth. There's nothing much more attached to it. It's important to the economy. You've got to understand the economics of it, et cetera. But it's just a commodity. If you live in Saudi Arabia, you think of oil and gas as some may think of oil and gas as a God-given right, as something that was bestowed upon you, right? That's a very different narrative. If you're going into a conversation, even a friendly conversation about energy, about pricing, about trade, and you're from those two countries, it would be nice to understand the other's perspective. And that's really what narrative analytics does, is in a systematic, scalable way, helps organizations understand that.
What do we do now in what has become already an era of artificial intelligence, chatbots that do customer service? How does that play into narrative science?
Yeah, so artificial intelligence and machine learning, I think, are very interesting here for a couple of reasons. Today, a lot of the exciting artificial intelligence stuff is around things like chatbots, which frankly aren't going to change the world. They may make it a little more efficient, but they're not going to change it, a little less expensive, but they're not going to change the world because they're not doing things that we can't do today. They're just doing things a little faster or a little bit cheaper. What I'm excited about with AI and with machine learning is when you can take on business problems that weren't otherwise addressable. And I think that narrative analytics is an example of that. Let's say you're working at a candy manufacturer and you want to know all the beliefs that people hold about sugar so that you can figure out how your public affairs and marketing should be adjusting to current realities. Well, that's a hard problem. And you could try to read everything that's out there, but it would be impossible to read every article, every post, every single time that something is mentioned about sugar directly, about health and wellness, about well-being and snacking, about all the different fringe areas there. It would be basically impossible to do it unless you had a mechanism that allowed machines to gather understanding, to categorize, and to figure these things out. And that is very much what I think we're doing. We're basically, the way narrative analytics works is we use a machine to identify what the underlying narratives are, what the underlying beliefs are. There's then a human intervention. The machine is trained by humans who will then agree or disagree with the way the machine has organized things. And then there's a categorization process where every piece of data and information gets categorized and assigned to a particular narrative. Well, that is actually a machine learning and AI process, and I think that application is really gonna is what lets us measure narratives, track narratives, and do this thing at tremendous scale. And what I'm excited about is it means that people in the world are going to have greater understanding of issues at a greater level of granularity.
Is it a form then of content analysis or rhetorical analysis that gets you to that narrative?
Both. So what we do is we're looking at the claim, by rhetorical, I think what you're referring to is sort of the claims or arguments that are made.
Mm-hmm.
We're not saying are these arguments true or false, but what are the arguments, right? Sugar, just to stick with the example, like sugar is bad, sugar isn't so bad. The companies are being deceitful. The companies are being reasonable. These are all different arguments that are made. These arguments can get clustered into effectively stories that are then connected to outcomes, emotion levels, and various other narrative elements that allow us to construct or really to deconstruct a narrative from the public, from the data, and then construct a set of narratives that we can then track through the landscape.
Is the tracking of then these narratives at all linked back to, I guess, what marketers would call key performance indicators? You mentioned behavior, basically tracking changes in behavior and the relationship between the narratives and the behavior?
Yeah, okay. So level one of the hard part of what we're doing is just identifying and measuring the narratives. I mean, just to say the narrative on, sugar is like big sugar is like big tobacco. Just finding that narrative and measuring it and knowing how it's moving is a challenge. Level two is exactly what you just said, is now let's connect that to what's happening in a business. Our customers are interested in two things there. One is, did we push that narrative? have we had an influence on that narrative? Is that narrative consistent with the things that we're saying? And then the second thing that they're interested in is to what extent are we to what extent is that connected to our other key performance indicators beyond communications, which might include sales or legislation passed or whatever's relevant. And so yes, that is kind of what narrative analytics does, is it connects the measurement of narrative to key performance indicators. And that's really the territory that we're going to be, breaking ground in the coming years.
How long has your business been around?
Well, it's funny. We've been around in different ways for about, depending on how you count it, about 5 years. In its early days, what we were doing was that work for the National Security Council and other organizations, and we were doing this all with humans, all analysts, PhDs in political science and social scientists going out doing this stuff, and doing it as academics or journalists would. So conducting interviews, synthesizing information, and coming back and saying, here are the narratives. It was about 3 years ago that we got the vision that we could have technology do this. And we've been since then first working with other technology platforms, and then starting about a year ago, launched our own platform, which is just used internally by our consultants today and our narrative experts today. We launched the Protagonist Platform. And that was designed from the ground up to apply machine learning to identifying, measuring, and then ultimately shaping narratives.
It seems that increasingly, even advertising is using organic conversation to pitch its message.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. I think what we're doing is helping you understand how that organic movement is happening, right? Because what's interesting today, I think, is that many marketers will talk about how difficult and frustrating it is that narrative, particularly if they're in not doing so well, that narratives are moving very quickly, right? With social media, I can't even keep track of stuff. I've got a whack-a-mole situation going on. It's hard to understand anything. And that is true. It is. And and a marketer and people, social media monitoring groups, people like that often find themselves in a whack-a-mole game. And that's a challenge. The contribution that we're making to that is that there's also incredible data and insight that's coming from that. Now, once you have that map, what was once organic can start to get shaped a little bit if that's, kind of what you're interested in. And we do that work. We work with companies. We work with foundations who are concerned about climate change or about ethics and morality in technology companies, or about education. And they will look at that organic conversation and with that understanding, decide how to shift their messaging, or decide how to shift their programs, or decide which areas they should fund more or less of. So it is the map to guide what is going on in the world. The way we measure narratives now, though we use machine learning, still requires human intervention in a number of different places. There's tremendous demand to get our tool directly to consumers or customers so they can use it directly. They can form the narratives themselves and do all the measurements themselves. But right now, the science behind it is a little bit too complex to make it kind of a SaaS platform. When we get there, I think things will really scale because there's such a hunger out there to understand narratives. Networks are really, really interesting because what happens with networks is people wind up confining their information intake to a certain set of sources, people, resources within a network, and then start to believe that that is the full range of beliefs when it may really be a very narrow range of beliefs. And I think that's happened in our country quite a bit at the macro level, where you've got, just to use the election as an example, we had elites, liberal elites, who were convinced that the election discourse was about one set of issues. But then we had the winning party, the Trump supporters, who believed it was about a different set of issues. And neither group was stupid. Neither group couldn't understand the other narratives. They just didn't believe them. They just didn't believe that they were resonant, that they were the ones that were going to dominate, that they were the important ones. And I think that um, that's really important, and that happens to us all the time. We see it with foundations quite often, where a foundation has a systems view of the world and believes that people are talking about the policy issues and the kind of the intricacies, and then let's say it's on education, and then the parents are just saying, "I just want my child to have a job." And there may be a total disconnect in communications, whether they're on the same side of things or not. And so, again, I think with social networks, we wind up being influenced by a smaller group of people who wield a tremendous amount of power. Now, what narrative analytics tries to do is say, again, no judgment on any of the narratives, but let's at least understand who is driving a narrative. If there's a particular individual or set of individuals, or if there's a particular channel or set of channels that is having a dominant impact on a narrative, wouldn't it be nice to know that? Either because we want to track that to understand if it's changing, or because we want to, influence that person, or either by amplifying what they're saying, or by arguing with what they're saying, or whatever. But that knowledge and understanding is very, very important. If we want to progress, if we want to get along better with other countries inside our country, if we want to launch great products that people buy, we need to understand the other. And empathy is so important in the world, and empathy at scale just seems like a great next step. And in essence, I think narrative analytics is bringing empathy at scale, along with all the other applications that we've talked about today, so that we can just understand one another better.